Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it happens to be. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John. I'm an author, and welcome to my writing corner. We're here on another Storytime Thursday where I'm going to be reading chapter 15 of my book, The Shadow of the Past. I hope you enjoy. I would love to hear your comments, what you liked, what you didn't, what you think of the characters and the story so far in the chapter and my voices, etc. And everything like that, as well as I would really love it for if you would like the video, share it with your friends, subscribe to my channel. All of that would be amazing. All right, with that little intro out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and get started with chapter 15, Through the Dragon's Pass. Gera streaked through the last widely spaced trees at the forest's edge and back out onto the plains. Val'inar was pleased with the horse's performance. He had only allowed it a few hours' rest the previous night, and yet it still kept up a swift pace throughout the day. So pleased, in fact, that he had named the horse simply the Wind in the tongue of his own people, and could certainly run like it. It was shortly after the dawn the day after he departed to Karn, and the mountains loomed ahead of him. He would reach them by nightfall or perhaps early tomorrow, depending upon how long he had to talk with the wind elemental. He did not know the name of this Lord of Wind, or even for sure that it was a lord or not a lady, but as he approached the place of power, he began to sense that it was indeed a Lord of Wind which called him. He had not seen a single living person since noon the previous day, when another small band of Tri had come up beside him and been informed of his dealings with Sir Deimos Frelin. They seemed pleased with this and went streaking off towards the north. He knew they were making for where the Union's main army was stationed, the large wooded valley east of the mountains, which led directly to the heartland of the Union, almost due north of Takarim. Val'inar was racing as much west as north, making for the faint tremor within the air that called out to him as the Bastion of Winds. He did not know where it was, but he could feel himself drawing nearer with each mile, nearer and nearer, hour by hour. He was not even sure what he was looking for, whether it be some high, windy tower or a forgotten city or something else entirely. It was getting towards evening when he finally spotted what he was looking for. As Gera emerged from another small patch of forest atop a high hill, he saw it in the distance, a deep trench running southwest to northeast that looked as if it had been carved into a hillside. There were three pairs of small towers, each with a bridge between them across this narrow span. The towers looked untouched by the passage of time, and the place almost radiated with the power of the wind. So much that Val'inar heard the wind howling through the artificial crevice within the area before he was near enough to hear the whistling with his own ears. The power that resided within the place called him within the artificial crevice, and so he went. Val'inar had thought it a calm day, but the place seemed to have been designed to catch even the slightest breeze and amplify it. His cloak and hair, as well as his horse's mane, began whipping as if in a strong wind before they even entered. Val'inar saw after entering that great doors and windows had been carved into the rock itself, and it was clear that, as with Matra, that this rock had been imbued with the air. The granite that made up the mountain foothills was strong, to be sure, but against the rushing wind, Val'inar knew that it should have taken mere centuries to wear the carvings down. And yet this place had stood untouched for millennium, and all the elegantly etched birds and beasts of the air looked as if they might have been carved mere days previously. The fissure was larger than it looked on the outside, and, since nothing seemed to rise to challenge him, Val'inar kept moving on. Here and there he saw the occasional much rusted sword or piece of armor, which Val'inar figured could not have been touched for an age. It was clear that this place had once been some kind of barracks, perhaps a watch point against whatever might lurk in the high passes through the mountains. It was not until Val'inar had ridden to what he judged to be about the center of the defile that what he had been waiting for happened at last. It seemed at first that some of the wind, sand and gravel was being stirred by a swirling wind, but as more and heavier pieces of stone were being lifted up, the vortex grew higher. It seemed to increasingly take the shape of a man. Val'inar dismounted when he saw this, and in the brief moment he took his eyes off the shape, it now resembled a tall, broad shouldered man, well over 6 feet tall, with a great long beard. It was difficult to tell whether he was wearing chain armor or a billowing robe, or perhaps he was wearing both. As Val'inar had come to expect from his dealings with the other elementals, the other only thing that stayed constant was the eyes, which seemed to hang in midair and glow a golden yellow color. They fixed Val'inar in place with a determined stare, but like his fellow elements, these eyes seemed weary almost beyond bearing. So, boomed a great voice, which seemed to echo all around Val'inar. You have come at last, Seira Elfen, come to seek the wisdom of the wind. While the booing lingered long as Val'inar heard other voices, some whistling, some whispering along with it. I have indeed, my lord of wind. May I know thy name and what this place is called? For I was not told and followed your calling through the area to get here. In the tongue of your own people, this place is called Hosai Gera, replied the voice. This time the whistling seemed the loudest. Or the towers of whistling winds. The men of steel call this the three watchtowers, but make no use of it, and the Tri-Shelta worship this place and name it not. As for myself, I was once called Enderon, although that was long ago. Sometimes called the Mighty, although I would not be surprised if there are none that live who remember that. If I appear at all in the records of mortals, for once I advised the human king of Tricameral, as it was called at the time, and then I was known simply as the Lord of Whispering Winds. I do not doubt that even the Knights of Shadow, formed by House Freylon 500 years ago on the pattern of my Order of Whispering Knights, are unfamiliar with my name. I am honored to meet you, bowed Val'inar deeply. I cannot boast of any great deeds, but for my part I am Val'inar, son of Yanira. Enderon tilted his head back and boomed a great laugh through the narrow valley. Boast? Yes, I suppose I do boast of what I have achieved, and why not? I have done many things in my life, and what is the use of doing great things if you cannot boast of them? But I can assure you that I have never boasted of anything idly. I was once both a great warrior and a wise counselor, for a strong arm is nothing without a good head, and words win more wars than swords and spears, as I taught my whispering knights long ago. Forgive me, I did not mean to offend, began Val'inar. Offend? Boomed Enderon again. Nonsense, that! What offense is there in speaking the truth? I will give you a piece of advice. Never take back anything you say, least of all the truth, for you do both yourself and those listening to you a great disservice by doing so. I will heed that advice, nodded Val'inar, although I have always been told to mind what one says. Oh, indeed, indeed, acknowledged Enderon. This time the whisper seemed to take the upper hand. But once something is said, it is said, and you will only make yourself look a fool if you try to take it back again. Remember, a wind can only ever flow in one direction at a time. I shall keep that in mind as well, said Val'inar. Now, as you no doubt know, I have come for whatever advice and aid you can give me in my journey. Of course, young elfling, returned Enderon, the whistle gaining the upper hand once more. What hast thou been told thus far by my old companions? I have been warned that the Lady Ushara, who controls the Union, is seeking for a way to release Kiral, an enemy you six bound away, from his imprisonment, replied Val'inar, thinking back on those conversations, which seemed so far distant now. I know that she is not of this terra, although I do not wholly know her purpose, other than to rule Sirana either through Kiral or through this union of hers. Unless you can give me more knowledge of this Ushara, I am more interested in Kiral. It took Enderon several minutes to respond, and when he did, his voice sounded hollow and distant. I have known her type before, but I have never met the Ushara, so I cannot give you any more information on her than you already have. I doubt any of us can. Kiral, on the other hand, is a different matter, being that I once considered him my oldest friend. Val'inar was aghast at this revelation and speechless for several moments. Your friend? He managed at last. Yes, admitted Enderon sadly, we were friends for a long time, the seven of us. We wandered across many terra, doing many great deeds for causes we judged just, with Kiral always in the lead, always wanting to set wrongs to right and make all we came across better for our presence, and we followed him in all things. He was the greatest of us, whether in the weaving of spells, in the clash of arms, or in the devising of strategy. Valinar's eyes widened with each new piece of information. You mean that you seven were not from Sirana? If you are not, where are you from, and how did you come to be here? No, admitted Enderon, we are not from Sirana. As to where I am from, sadly even I cannot remember, for it was long ago, and there are many memories betwixt then and now that I do not care to face or relive. Enderon's voice had sunk to the barest of whispers, and those yellow eyes which Valinar had once thought so feast were now dim and sad. As to when we came here, Enderon went on after a moment's pause, it was long ago, after a great devastation had swept across many terra. We seven were fortunate enough to survive, or so we thought at the time. Although with so many millennia of hardship and hindsight, I am not sure any longer. We decided to find somewhere peaceful, untouched by the destruction, where we could settle down and live free of hardship. After some years of searching, we found Sirana. This Terra is unusually isolated, hard to both find and get to, even for Terra Magi as powerful as Kiral was. Sirana is small, with only one great continent and some outlying islands. It was peaceful, untouched by greater wars, and almost entirely untraveled by other Terra Magi. It was perfect, and so we settled down here. Val'inar was puzzled by this. If you are from far away, how then did you come to be bound as you are to the different elements? Was that something that happened naturally? No, was Enderon's almost instantaneous reply. It was not a natural process. We lived here quietly for many long centuries, giving advice only occasionally and mainly keeping out of the way. But there were a few disasters during the centuries of our initial residence and a few wars that we felt we might have prevented. You see, there are the rules which govern those that can travel to other terra to prevent interference. Even if Sirana was isolated, we still feared being caught should we take a more active hand in the affairs of the people of this terra. So you bound yourselves to the elements of this terra, thus making it your home of sorts? Stated Valinar, pleased with the conclusion that he had reached. Indeed, Enderon replied, and seemed to smile as he did so. As with so many other things, all that came up with the solution. We bound ourselves to the elements, each to the one we felt most akin to, and Kiral bound himself to all together to serve as the balance. And is that what drove him mad? Inquired Valinar. Not at all, replied Enderon, his voice booming once more. We had millennia of peace and stability after we had done the deed. Under our guidance, the peoples of this terra built great cities and kingdom, prospered, and became greater than we had ever dared hope for. Then what happened to him? Enderon sighed, and his voice became like a soft whisper of wind once more. You remember that I said that Kiral always wanted to right wrongs and make things better? Yes, replied Valar, furrowing his brow, thinking that he was beginning to sense where this was going. He didn't just go mad, did he? No, admitted Enderon sadly. His intentions were good to start with, and then again, that is how it always starts. He started taking more and more active role in running those lands which he had taken it upon himself to oversee. He insisted that he knew what was best and that he was helping people. It took millennia, but gradually he became a king in all but name, finally began issuing decrees in his own name. He still claimed that he was doing it for his people, that he was saving them from themselves, but at that point we no longer knew our friend. And then he tried to force the rest of you to follow his lead, said Val'inar. It was not a question. Enderon nodded slowly. The war was brutal, vicious, and it lasted far longer than it should have. Many went over to his side in the beginning, feeling that he had the right of it. And as you have no doubt already been told, we could not overcome his power with our own, no matter how we tried. We fought each other to a standstill so many times, but we could never gain the advantage over him. He was too strong, and he knew us far too well. I was the first, but one by one we all lost our bodies to his fury, and in doing so discovered that we could not die. If it was not for the bravery of your ancestor, the war might well have continued to this day. Why did Shiniri not mention this to me when she told me of Kiral and his imprisonment? Seethed Val'inar. Shiniri always burned hotly, even before she was bound by fire, observed Enderon. She hated Kiral as much as she once loved him, and thus it is now easier for her to think of him only as our enemy, rather than as the friend and mentor he once was to us. Val'inar considered all that he had been told for some moments before finally asking, "Is there anything else you can tell me about Kiral?" Endron seemed to think for a moment before shaking his head. "You know all that I could tell you of him that would be useful to you. Do you have any other advice for me before I am on my way?" "Just this. Be careful should you ever face Kiral. Even while he was the best and bravest of us, he was also always the most deadly and dangerous," mused Valnar. "Now, as my companions are done, so too shall I do. I give to you the strength of the winds and the powers of the air." As he said this, Val'inar felt as if a great rushing wind was flowing through his body, and when it left, he felt stronger. He felt the winds racing across the plain, he felt the clouds high in the air, and the crackle of energy that lay dormant within them. "Thank you, Lord Enderon," he said, almost booming like Enderon. "You are welcome, high-born prince," bowed Enderon, "and I grant you this as well." As he spoke, a brief gust of wind blew away what Val'inar had thought was another small mound of dust. Beneath it, however, was a pair of greaves which looked to be of burnished silver, with symbols of wind carved within them. As Val'inar picked them up, however, he could feel that it was no mere bronze he held, but a much older and stronger metal, and along with their strange lightness he felt power within them. "Those will give you great speed to your feet and agility to your limbs whenever you should wear them," boomed Enderon. "Wear them well. I fear you shall need such aid in the days to come. Now, where do you plan to go hence?" "I must reach Anarakater, although I do not know how best to reach it, especially since that area is held by the Union," Val'inar informed Enderon. "You are in luck with two things," came the reply. "The first is that while the Anarakater is within the territory controlled by the Union, they do not approach it and will ride around it for miles rather than enter it." "And why is that?" Val'inar inquired. "Because while your people are long gone and dead, their power remains, and perhaps a few shadowed remnants of your people many generations removed from any right to the name Elf of Balance along with that power. For that is the Aeneas Vale, and in the living memory of all the mortal races, few that have entered have ever returned, and those that do are changed forever. Many times men and goblins have tried to reclaim Anarakater, claiming only disaster for themselves. History writes that it was Kemral who ended the Iron Lord's ambition, but in reality it was the fact that he foolishly sent 4,000 of his best knights to claim Anarakater for him, none of whom ever returned." Val'inar nodded grimly at this. "So it seems I must pass through yet more challenges before I reach the last two of the elementals. Well, whatever lies within the Veil of Twilight, we'll have to wait for a more pressing challenge. How am I to even get to this mysterious veil if I cannot get through Union-held lands?" "Oh, there is a way," boomed Enderon, nodding sagely. "To the northwest, about a day's ride from here, lies the entrance of one of the high passes into the mountains. It is called the Dragon's Pass, for it goes over a high mountain called Dragon's Peak. That was called thus even before we seven arrived here. The Union will not have any guard on the far side of the pass, which leads into a deep ravine, which spawns the main river, which leads into Aeneas Vale. The valley is fertile, but the Union will have no more than the occasional small patrol that watches the mountain pass. Why is that? Because neither the Tray nor the people of Cameral use that mountain pass, and the dwarves have never lived under the dragon's peak. And why is that? Is the mountain dangerous? The peak is high and cold, the third highest on Sirana in point of fact, although it is not impassable this time of year. Then why isn't it used? Val'inar was growing somewhat impatient. Because the mountain is said to be cursed, and none would dare sleep there, admitted Enderon, his voice now more of a whisper. There is a great tower at the top of the peak. The dragon's claw it is called of old. The ancient legends of this terra say that it was built at the dawning of days by the Dragon King himself, and upon the tower and the pass he laid a warning that it was a curse of death of any who slept within sight of the tower, and that any who wished to pass the towers did so at their own risk. It sounds like a local superstition, a way to warn people away from crossing a mountain pass that is high and dangerous, mused Val'inar. Enderon chuckled at this. You are perhaps right, but Dragon's Peak is neither particularly high nor is it particularly dangerous compared to other mountains. I have seen on other terra, and most winters are mild upon Sirana. Yet nevertheless few who venture over that pass are ever heard from again. However, I have a suspicion that you will make it just fine. Just don't sleep under the tower. Now you had best make haste. You have a long road ahead of you. With that, Enderon's form began to fade until all that Val'inar could see was a faint pair of yellow eyes staring at him, which soon faded away themselves. Val'inar stood for a few moments in quiet reflection of all that he had just heard, and then, renewing his resolve, he knelt to fasten his new greaves about his shins. Before springing onto the back of Gera and whispering into his ears, the horse took off like an arrow from a bow and was soon racing once more up and down the rocky foothills of the mountains. Val'inar made his course more west than north, so he saw he was already quite close to the mountains. He was not sure which was the dragon's pass, as he kept going on until nightfall. He would have gone on longer, but he feared that on this rocky road Gera might well do himself an injury, running at such a quick pace in the dark. And the horse was near spent as it was, so he hobbled the horse to graze and took some refreshment himself. For once, rather than the scarred entrance of Kiral's prison, Val'inar dreamed of Wynn that night, and of a high mountain tower that he had never seen before, which seemed to be both there and not at the same time. He woke at dawn, more refreshed than he had been in some weeks, and after eating a bit of bread and some fruit, he mounted Gera once more and was soon moving in a brisk trot closer and closer to the mountains. Around midday, he saw what looked like a small notch in the rising hills to his right, and as he got closer, he saw that it was a winding path heading up into the mountains. A whispering voice uh, said to him when he saw it up close, "That is it. That is the Dragon's Pass." And so he turned Gera onto it, and after what seemed like only a short time, he looked back and saw that he was now well above the shut-eye plain and was rising steadily. Shortly before he lost sight of where he had met Enderon, he heard one last whisper, "Do not sleep beneath the tower." All the rest of that day, Gyra climbed, and the pass grew wider and wider. Val'inar was still skeptical of whether or not the pass was cursed or dangerous, but there must have been something to prevent its use, because Val'inar judged that one could lead an army over this pass without much difficulty during the summer months. It was getting toward evening before they hit any snow at all, and even that was not deep, but merely a light dusting that did not slow his progress at all. It was a short while before dark when Val'inar finally caught a glimpse of it, the dragon's claw. He did not doubt that it He did not doubt that it must have been an impressive tower once upon a time, rising perhaps 800 feet above the peak of the mountain, but rather mountain, and but that for a long time. He had approached to see what kind of stone made up its construction, but the tower was desolate and great chunks were missing from its base. It broke off suddenly about halfway up, with much ruined stonework lying on the ground. The stone seemed to be a dull red, although the stairs that led up to its entrance were carved into the granite mountainside. Val'inar found the tower disturbing, since it looked very much like the tower he had seen in a vision some weeks ago, but that was nothing compared to how Gera was frightened by it. The horse slowed and became extremely skittish as they drew even with the tower. It took many whispered words from Val'inar, and even at one point Val'inar reaching into the horse's mind and drove him onward to get Gyra to pass the tower. When he was in the horse's mind, he felt the terror and foreboding that seemed to radiate from the tower, and he was somewhat troubled that he could not feel it himself. Although he could swear that just for a moment, that the blues, that just for a moment, that the tower seemed to warn of the curse of sleeping beneath it. As horse and rider began their slow descent down the mountain pass, Val'inar looked back and stretched forth his mind towards the tower. But all he could sense was the ancient and empty building of the remaining woven spells. Val'inar tried as hard as he could to put the whole rather unsettling experience out of his mind, which was aided by the need to guide his wearied horse out of the bright high paths. Finally, as the first rays of dawn were creeping over the horizon, Garrus trotted slowly through a narrow defile, which brought him out of the snow and onto the broad northern slope of the mountain. Stretched out before them were the vast Dilnura lowlands. Val'inar, far-seeing eyes, saw to his left the barren waste of the Great Desolation, which he knew housed the prison of Kiral. To his right was the dense forest and rich farmer lands of Telmar and the independent cities, and straight ahead snaked the dragon's tail. As the river was called, shimmering blue and yellow through the waning pool, his eyes followed the river, and he saw in the distance that the river split around a high forested hill, forming two fertile valleys around it. Val'inar noticed that despite the rising of the sun, it seemed like the sunlight never touched either of those valleys, although it certainly glinted off the rocks and hills. As soon as he looked at that hill long and hard, he got a feeling that he had never felt even after living for more than 2 centuries in the Taranu forest. He felt like he was looking at home. Val'inar smiled at this thought for a few moments before finally returning to the challenges that lay before him, not the least of which was whatever might wait for him in the Vale of Twilight, and with a resigned grin he leaned forward and whispered to Gera, "Come on, boy, let us see if we can't get down to the river before laying it, having a nice long rest." Gera whickered as if in assent, and the two set off at a slow pace down the side of the mountain. All right, that was chapter 15. I really hope you enjoyed it. Again, I would really love to hear your comments and feedback, whether that be about my reading, the content of the story, the book so far, whatever you feel like giving me feedback about. I love it. So please keep doing that. And I will catch you on the next one. I hope you all have an exceptional day. And I do hope you have the chance to do or experience something creative.